when I heard the first question about the question you asked about some people spending while some people are not able to spend, I thought of it in an international context in terms of how countries are able to trade with each other. And my own question to your question is really, right? Given the global crisis that has been happening mainly in the advanced industrialized countries, now I think is the best time more than ever to actually foster South trade. That is trade between developing countries. How that is to happen, I do not know. But the thing is that what is clear is that you need some kind of decoupling of trade in the sense that developing countries who themselves were not directly, have not been directly affected by the crisis, indirectly of course, but not directly, could actually themselves trade and therefore help to develop their economies. So that's a question I am raising to your question.
I'm looking at Pat. We will take another round of questions. So I'll take 4 questions. There's a gentleman there next to Jane and the lady behind. If you can identify yourselves and we'll go one at a time.
I'm Matt Bishop from the University of Sheffield in the UK, soon to be IIR here at UE. I've got a couple of questions, one for Professor Kapoor and one for Professor Watson. For Professor Kapoor, if possible, I'd just like to push you a bit on some of the things you said about the IMF. You suggested that some of the bigger countries are going to have to start borrowing from the IMF and there's going to be a loosening of the conditionality regime. Now, it's my understanding that the extra $500 billion that has been pledged, President Obama's had quite a lot of trouble getting their section, the US's portion of that, through Congress. And a lot of that money is at the moment still just pledged. And secondly, on the conditionality issue, so the corollary of that the first point is that the IMF doesn't actually have that much money. I mean, it couldn't really even underwrite just the UK banking system, let alone, you know, any bigger, any more than that. And then on the conditionality issue, it's my understanding that Latvia and Ukraine have recently taken big loans. And the conditionality has been more of the same. Latvia has slashed its public sector budget. The Ukraine has still been pressured to keep the liberalisation agenda up. So I just wonder if you could comment on that, please. And for Professor Watson, in terms of diversification, I just wonder about agriculture. It strikes me that in the Caribbean, there's always been this assumption recently that export agriculture has declined. Well, what about domestic agriculture? What about food security? What about production for Caribbean export? What about institutionalizing and some kind of guiding of the state in order to engender, you know, serious agricultural development to guard against rises in food prices in the future, which are bound to come around again as commodities explode at some point in the near future. So I just wonder if you'd mind commenting on that, please. Thanks.
Yes, good morning. My name is Catherine Skillercat, Vancouver Island University in Canada. I was very interested to hear in several presentations, and one more specifically, Professor Weston, the comment about economic theory and the potential for a change in certain fundamental conceptualization of development. And I think it's a theme that has come at least in 3 of the presenters' comments. And on the other hand, it seems to me that, such as Greenspan, you know, he admitted that his model was erroneous and the crisis that took place was largely due to this fundamental belief in market liberalization. On the other hand, the presenter who talked about what we're doing today and what we're going to go back tomorrow. So it seems that there is this, okay, economic theory was wrong and development problems such as the debt crisis came from that. But at the same time, we're going to go back to that. Like, we're going to fix this in the short term, but we're going to go back to that. So to what extent exactly do any of the presenters feel that this crisis is actually going to create a conceptual, fundamental change in economic theory? Thanks.
I just have a quick question. Given the story that Anthony told about the pressures on the Jamaican currency and Patrick's contention that the Caribbean countries are so closely linked to the American economy already, I'm just wondering if dollarization is on the agenda for any Caribbean country.
When I listened to Professor Dearcoran's presentation on economic theory and practice, a crisis of economic theory and practice, I asked myself, where did the influence come from historically on issues of orthodoxies in theory and practice? And so without going back too far and thinking about the work of Arthur Lewis, I think of the work of the Brandt Commission. And the Brandt Commission on North-South, it sought to look at the world and it sought to give some prescriptions of policy and possibly theory. So my question concretely is that if you feel that one needs to influence economic theories and practices of the future, might it be time to have a new type of Brandt Commission that would, because when I look at the debates, I see Paul Krugman engaging in all kinds of debates in the columns of the New York Times, and Professor Watson referred to this Barrow, whom I don't know who he is. I assume he's not Errol Barrow, our guy. You know, so, but I think that somehow or the other, we shouldn't leave the debates to these guys like Krugman and whatnot on the pages of the New York Times. Maybe we need a new Brandt Commission. I'd appreciate your comment on that. Thanks.
Okay. Over to our panelists to address these four very interesting questions. Who would like to go first? Mr. Dukaran.
I think there are two questions I picked up that I would like to just give a brief comment on. The issue of agricultural diversification in the Caribbean and the notion of food security. In fact, and my friend comment on there isn't very much protectionism. In the area of food, there has been, within recent times, countries that have decided to ban the exportation of food in the name of not so much food security as much as food sovereignty, as the issue that is now engaging those in this field, that is control over the sources of food, as opposed to just security, which is the control over the supplies. And that is a tendency towards a protectionist measure. And if we were to do it in the Caribbean, which has eluded us for all these years, it will tend to be a kind of policy that will generate endogenous growth, which is where we got to go. And that is the point I was making earlier, that in the short term, you got to do that in any event because your capacity to have food security by buying food is going to be reduced. And therefore, you have to go into an endogenous growth in food production. And it has eluded us. It's a technical, much more a technical issue. It is a whole political economy issue, which has to be addressed, but it should be done. So I agree with that. The question of whether or not I would say that economic theory is fundamentally flawed. I'm not too sure I'm ever would be in a position to make such an assertion. But what I can say is that the prescriptions for today, in fact, is in opposition to the requirements for tomorrow. And that is our challenge for economic theory. How do we satisfy the immediate prescriptions like deficit financing on one hand? Seems to be a legitimate prescription for today. But at the same time, the requirement for tomorrow is debt sustainability. And even in the larger economies, that issue is now rearing its head in terms of all the funds that have been pushed into the financial sector and who is going to pay for that and when and how.